What if one quiet sentence spoken years ago saved a veteran's life, changed a daughter's purpose, and sparked a movement inside the White House? This isn't just a celebrity interview. This is the day Steve Harvey broke down in tears on live TV as Karoline Leavitt revealed how his words brought her father back from the edge. From one whisper of faith to a national policy saving thousands, what unfolds is raw, real, and unforgettable. If you've ever wondered whether your voice still matters, don't miss this. Because what happens next might just restore your hope in this country. The lights came up and the energy in the studio crackled with warmth, laughter, and the familiar rhythm of the Steve Harvey show. Steve stepped onto the stage in a smooth gray suit, his signature smile lighting up the room. He waved to the cheering crowd, grabbed his cue cards, and launched into the kind of light-hearted opening his audience had come to love. "We've got someone special today," he beamed. "This young woman, she's been shaking up Washington like it's a snow globe. But don't worry, she's not here to argue politics. She's here to share something different." That got the crowd's attention. A ripple of curiosity moved through the studio audience, many of whom had shown up, expecting the usual mix of laughs and behind-the-scenes political gossip. And when Karoline Leavitt walked out, the applause grew louder. Dressed in a crisp blue blazer, her hair neatly pulled back, she looked polished, but approachable. Young, confident, but grounded. The kind of person you'd expect to see on TV, but maybe not in the West Wing. Steve greeted her with his classic charm. "Now, Karoline," he said, grinning wide as they both took their seats. "You're working at the White House. You're in your 20s. At your age, I was still trying to figure out how to iron a shirt. You ever feel like quitting?" It was meant to be funny. The audience chuckled right on cue. But Karoline didn't laugh. Not right away. She smiled politely, then glanced at something on Steve's chest. Her eyes lingered just a moment too long on the small silver cross hanging from a thin chain just above the lapel of his jacket. And in that instant, something shifted. A beat passed. Her smile faded. The studio, once full of bright laughter, felt suddenly quieter. Still. Steve leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised, curious. The moment hadn't gone unnoticed. He was a master of reading the room, and right now, the room was holding its breath. Karoline finally spoke, but her voice was softer. "That cross," she said, gently nodding toward it. "It's beautiful." Steve looked down at his chest and instinctively reached for the cross, his fingers closing around it. He gave a modest shrug. "It's been with me a long time," he said almost as an afterthought. "Keeps me steady." The camera cut briefly to the audience. Some viewers nodded. Others sat forward in their seats, sensing what was coming. Gaz's Osofing wasn't on any script. Karoline looked at Steve, her gaze calm but heavy with emotion. "I was going to answer your question," she said, her voice now steadier. "But if I'm honest, I've never told this on TV before. And I think today, maybe I'm supposed to." Steve blinked. He wasn't smiling anymore. And just like that, the atmosphere of the show flipped on a dime. Gone was the casual banter, the setup for punchlines. In its place was a raw silence, not uncomfortable but sacred, the kind of stillness you get when something real is about to be shared. No applause, no cue cards, just two people sitting face to face, one of them about to lay bare a story that would change both their lives and the lives of everyone watching. In just under 2 minutes, the tone of the entire show had changed. Not with a dramatic twist or flashy production, but with something far more powerful, a moment of truth. Karoline wasn't just a guest anymore. She was a daughter, a believer, a fighter, someone who had walked through shadows and was ready to speak light into them. Steve sat back, hands resting on his knees, eyes locked on her, his own, cross catching the light. He didn't know it yet, but the next few minutes would leave him speechless in tears and forever changed. In the audience, they weren't just watching a talk show anymore. They were witnessing a moment of divine interruption. The silence in the studio stretched not awkwardly, but reverently. Karoline Leavitt sat across from Steve Harvey, her gaze steady, her hands folded in her lap as if bracing for what she was about to share. The smile from moments earlier had faded. The weight in her voice was unmistakable. Something was coming, something she hadn't planned to say until this very moment. Steve, she began quietly, I've always admired how you talk about your faith. You don't shout it, you live it. And that cross, it reminded me of someone. My dad. Steve nodded gently, eyes soft, hand still resting near his own cross. My father is a veteran, a proud one. She continued. He served overseas, came back with a chest full of medals, and eyes that never looked quite the same. There was a pause, a shift in her tone. The audience leaned in. When I was little, he was the strongest man I knew. He built our porch by hand, fixed every engine in town, never missed a church Sunday. But after his last tour, something changed. He didn't talk much anymore. He stopped going to church. He'd just sit, quiet, detached. She swallowed hard. The room remained silent. We used to laugh around the dinner table, Karoline said, her voice cracking slightly. But after he came home, dinner turned into silence. Long, empty silences. If we asked him questions, he'd nod. But that spark, that joy in his eyes was gone. It's like he left something of himself back on that battlefield and didn't know how to get it back. Steve sat quietly, his usual lightheartedness gone, replaced by something deeper, something paternal, protective. Karoline took a breath, her hands clasping tighter. We didn't know the term back then, but now I do. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's real, it's silent, and it eats away at the people we love. There was a soft murmur in the audience, people nodding, some wiping their eyes. Many knew exactly what she meant. They'd lived it or were living it now. One night, Karoline said, her voice now firmer, more deliberate. I came home from work late. I was exhausted, stressed from DC, deadlines, and press briefings. But when I walked past the living room, I saw the light on. My father was sitting in his old recliner. Still quiet, I almost passed by. But something stopped me. Her eyes darkened. He had a paper in his hands. I thought it was mail or a newspaper, but when I looked closer, it was a letter. His name at the top, signed, dated. It was a suicide note. The audience gasped. Steve's face dropped, stunned. My knees gave out. She continued. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there frozen, trying to process that the man who raised me, the man who taught me to fight for what's right, was ready to give up on himself. Her voice now trembled. I remember whispering, Dad, and he looked up, and for the first time in years, he cried. My dad, this quiet, strong, unbreakable man, was crying like a child. Steve's eyes filled. The studio was still, the air heavy with shared pain. I sat with him for hours, Karoline said. No speeches, no solutions. Just sat. We didn't talk much that night, but it was the night I realized how close I had come to losing him, and how little I really understood about what he'd carried back from war. She looked at Steve, her eyes shining but steady. That night broke something in me, Steve. I wasn't just heartbroken, I was angry. Angry at myself for not seeing the signs. Angry at the VA system. Angry at God. The word God echoed quietly in the studio. For weeks after that, I struggled, she said. I went through the motions, I worked, I smiled, I gave press briefings. But inside I was lost. Because if someone like my father, who gave everything, could feel that invisible, that hopeless, what hope did anyone else have? Steve finally spoke, voice low and shaken. Karoline, I don't know what to say. That's a heavy thing to carry. She nodded. It is. And I didn't want to carry it. But now I know I'm supposed to. The audience stayed silent, holding the space. No applause, no movement, just presence. Karoline continued, her voice growing firmer, though her hands still trembled slightly in her lap. I used to think courage was about speaking up at press conferences or pushing a bill through Congress. But I've come to believe courage is when a man who's seen hell wakes up one more day and decides to stay. Steve looked down, hand brushing his cross. That's why your question hit me so hard, she said, her voice softening again. You ever feel like quitting? Yes, Steve, I have. But the moment I saw my father holding that paper, I realized quitting isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. It happens in living rooms behind closed doors where no one's watching. She paused, scanning the faces in the audience, some of them nodding slowly, others openly crying. I don't know how many people watching this have a father, a brother, a husband, or a son who came home different, she said. But I want you to know I see you. I see them. And they're not weak. They're not broken. They're warriors. They just carry wounds we can't see. Steve swallowed hard, his voice catching, as he replied, Karoline, thank you for saying what so many people can't. And just like that, the show that started in laughter had become something else entirely. It had become a place of truth, of healing, of silent strength. And this was just the beginning. The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Steve Harvey sat still, his fingers resting on the silver cross that had just become a bridge between him and the young woman sitting across from him. Karoline Leavitt had laid bare the story of her father, a veteran crushed under the invisible weight of war, and the night she found him clutching a suicide note. The audience wasn't watching a show anymore. They were living a moment of raw humanity. But Karoline wasn't done. She took a deep breath as if preparing to open a door she had kept shut for too long. Steve, she said, her voice steady but soft. What happened next? I still believe it wasn't just chance. I believe it was sent from above. Steve nodded slowly, leaning forward, drawn in by something deeper than curiosity, something like reverence. The day after I found that note, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. I went through work like a ghost, Karoline continued. That night, I came home and just collapsed on the couch. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to pray. Honestly, I didn't even want to feel. The audience remained frozen in silence, as if every breath had been pulled into her words. I picked up the remote, not for anything in particular. I just needed background noise. Something to block the thoughts. She glanced at Steve, and for the first time, a faint smile flickered across her lips, one tinged with something deeper. And that's when it happened, she said. I landed on a channel by accident. You were on the screen, not doing comedy, not hosting Family Feud. You were just standing there, on a stage, alone, talking about something real. Steve blinked. What was I saying? Karoline looked him straight in the eye. Healing doesn't always shout, she quoted. Sometimes it whispers in the silence. Steve went still. That one sentence, she said. It went through me like lightning, like someone finally said what I'd been feeling but couldn't put into words. I rewound it, watched it again, wrote it down. A few audience members gasped quietly. Others bowed their heads. The moment felt sacred, like a divine interruption in a world full of noise. Karoline's voice dropped. Steve, I didn't know what made you say that or when you said it, but in that moment you were speaking to me, and I knew what I had to do. She reached into the small folder resting on her lap and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. I wrote it down. On the back of a grocery receipt, I carried it in my purse for weeks. Steve sat up straighter. His throat tightened. You're serious. I'm dead serious, she said. The next morning I went into my dad's room. He was sitting by the window, quiet as usual. I didn't say anything. I just placed my phone on the nightstand and hit play. She paused. He didn't speak, didn't even blink. He just sat there, listening to your voice. And when it ended, he looked out the window for a long time. Then he did something I never expected. Karoline leaned in, her voice gaining strength. He stood up, walked past me, and got in his truck. I didn't know where he was going. I was too stunned to ask. The audience was locked in. About 30 minutes later, she said he called me. That was the first time he'd called me, not just picked up, but called in months. He said 5 words I will never forget. I'm at the VA clinic. Steve's lips parted slightly. His eyes widened. His hand slowly moved back to the cross resting over his chest. He checked himself in for counseling, Karoline said, tears brimming in her eyes. First time in 8 years. Steve leaned back, overwhelmed. I I don't even know what to say. Karoline wiped a tear, her voice trembling. That moment saved my father, and you didn't even know you were part of it. One line, one truth spoken into the dark. It lit something in him. The camera panned briefly to the audience. Many were crying quietly, holding hands. One older gentleman in the third row, wearing a Vietnam veteran cap, wiped a tear from his cheek. Steve tried to find his words, but his voice cracked. Karoline, I've said a lot of things over the years, but I never imagined this. She smiled through her tears. You didn't have to imagine it. You just had to say it. And God did the rest. Steve looked down, his hand clutching the cross like an anchor. I was just talking, trying to get through my own storm. And that's what made it real, she replied. It wasn't a sermon. It wasn't a headline. It was your pain spoken out loud that became someone else's healing. The words hit like thunder in the room. Steve let out a shaky breath, overwhelmed. The audience remained respectfully quiet, caught in the holiness of the moment. Karoline looked out across the studio. There are people watching this right now who've lost someone, or almost did. People who think they can't reach them. But I'm here to tell you, sometimes the words they need aren't loud. They're whispered, like the one Steve whispered into our living room that night. She turned back to Steve. I just wanted you to know, you weren't just a voice on a screen. You were the hand that helped pull my dad and me out of the dark. Steve covered his mouth with his hand, tears spilling from his eyes. He shook his head slowly as if trying to absorb the weight of what she'd said. I've had folks tell me I made them laugh, he said finally, voice rough. I've had people say I helped them dream, but saving a life. That's something else. I'm humbled, Karoline. Truly. Karoline reached across the space between them and gently placed her hand over his. You were just being yourself, Steve. And that was enough. And in that moment, it was clear the cross Steve wore wasn't just jewelry. It was a signpost for her, for him, for anyone who'd ever needed a reason to keep going. The whisper that saved her father wasn't broadcast with applause. It wasn't delivered with a spotlight. It was spoken in truth, born in pain, and heard in the quietest moment of the night. And it was enough to change everything. Steve Harvey sat motionless, stunned like a man who'd just been hit by a truth too big for words. His hand almost involuntarily reached up to his chest and rested on the small silver cross that had up until this moment been just a quiet symbol of his personal faith. Now it felt heavier than ever, like it carried the weight of someone else's miracle. His lips parted, but no full sentence came out. Only fragments. I never thought, he whispered, voice cracking. I was just trying to say something real. His fingers trembled slightly over the cross as he stared at Karoline, eyes clouded with emotion. The man America had come to know for his quick wit and booming laugh suddenly looked small, human, vulnerable, completely undone. Karoline didn't look away. You didn't just say something real. Steve, she said, steady but emotional. You saved my father's life, and you changed mine too. Steve's shoulders slumped forward, and the studio filled with the kind of silence you only hear in church or at funerals. The kind of silence that makes your throat tighten and your heart listen harder. And then, without trying to hold it back, Steve Harvey began to cry. Not the kind of tears that come from a sentimental story or a hallmark moment. These were the raw gut level sobs of a man suddenly faced with the fact that his words he'd once spoken from his own pain, had reached far beyond what he could have imagined. His right hand covered his mouth. His left still gripped the cross. Karoline didn't interrupt. She let him sit in it, let him feel every ounce of what it meant. She understood. Sometimes tears are the only honest response when the truth finally makes itself known. The audience didn't clap, they didn't cheer. Many were wiping their own eyes, nodding slowly, feeling the same mix of heartbreak and healing ripple through the room. This wasn't a performance. This was something sacred unfolding in real time. Steve finally looked up. His eyes were red, his voice low and unsteady. I never thought I'd be the one who needed to hear this, he said. But I did. I needed this more than you'll ever know. Karoline's voice softened. Maybe that's why you said it in the first place. Steve chuckled gently through his tears. You know, all these years I've tried to be useful, make people laugh, help them forget their pain for a while. But to think I helped somebody not give up on life. He broke again, unable to finish the sentence. He covered his face with both hands now, and for a long few seconds, the only sound in the studio was the quiet sob of a man who just realized he'd been part of a rescue mission he never signed up for. Karoline leaned forward slightly, her tone rich with gratitude. Steve, you didn't just give my dad hope, you gave it to me too. After that night, I started seeing everything differently. My work, my purpose, the platform I'd been given. I didn't want to just survive in Washington. I wanted to do something that could help other people survive people like my dad. Steve lowered his hands and looked at her with tear-glassed eyes. What do you mean? I mean, she said that your words became more than comfort. They became a cause. He blinked, confused. A cause, Karoline nodded, a proud fire starting to build in her voice. I've spent the last year working on a policy initiative at the White House. It's not public yet, but it will be. It's called the Silent Strength Project. It's designed to help veterans and their families find mental health support, not just through medical channels, but through community, through faith, through Pearl's personal connection. The kind of connection you gave me. Steve leaned back, visibly floored. You're telling me, he said slowly, that something I said became government policy. Karoline smiled. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Because I realized if one sentence from a talk show could save a man's life, what if we built a structure around that same idea? What if we created a place where people didn't feel forgotten in their pain? Steve shook his head in disbelief. I ain't no preacher. I ain't no doctor. No, she agreed. You're something better. You're real. That broke him again. He covered his mouth with one hand and reached for a tissue with the other, the audience watching a man stripped down to his core, not in shame, but in awe. I just try to be myself, Steve whispered. I never thought being myself was worth all this. Karoline looked at him and said the words that would stay with him long after the camera stopped rolling. You never know who's listening when you choose to speak with truth. The camera cut briefly to the crowd. A man in the front row, clearly a veteran in a tan army jacket, had removed his hat and was holding it over his heart. A woman in the second row clutched her husband's hand, both of them with tears in their eyes. Steve let out a long breath, still visibly shaken, and looked back at Karoline. I'm not the same man who walked onto this stage, he said. You've changed something in me. She reached across the table and gently touched his hand. You did the same for me. And now I'm passing it forward. That's what we're supposed to do, right? Not just survive, but help others stand. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, of grace, of revelation. The kind of silence where hearts mend and hope sneaks back in through the cracks. This wasn't just a talk show anymore. It was a moment of awakening, and it was only the beginning. Steve Harvey was still wiping his tears when Karoline Leavitt leaned in with something more, something deeper than even the story of her father's healing. The studio was silent, the energy still charged with the emotional tidal wave that had swept across the room. But what came next would shift the conversation from the past to the future, from pain to purpose. She looked Steve in the eyes and said quietly, There's something I haven't told the public yet, not in a press conference, not on cable news. I wanted the first place I shared it to be here, with you. Steve, visibly humbled, nodded slowly. I'm listening. Karoline took a breath. Her voice was clear but filled with quiet intensity. After that night when I found my dad's letter, and after the day he walked into the VA clinic on his own, something inside me shifted. I stopped seeing myself as just a press secretary. I realized I was holding a platform that needed to mean something. She glanced briefly toward the audience, then back at Steve. There are thousands, maybe millions of veterans across this country who are still sitting in silence, who come home not to parades but to quiet living rooms and quiet pain. They don't ask for help, they don't shout, They whisper if they speak at all. Steve leaned forward, his brow furrowed. He understood. Every word hit like truth. And I kept thinking about what you said in that video, Caroline continued. Healing doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the silence. That line stuck with me. It became the seed for something bigger. Steve blinked. What are you saying? Caroline smiled gently. I'm saying that whisper, Steve, became a movement. She reached into the folder on her lap, again not with tears this time, but with purpose, and pulled out a document. It's called the Silent Strength Initiative, she said, holding it up. It's a new policy plan we're advancing through the White House. It focuses on reaching veterans who are suffering quietly, those who fall through the cracks because they're not loud, not dramatic. We're partnering with churches, community centers, faith-based counselors, and peer mentors. The goal is to catch the ones no one sees. Steve was speechless. His mouth opened slightly, but he said nothing. This initiative, Caroline explained, provides confidential support accesses for veterans dealing with PTSD, depression, or isolation, not just through federal channels, which, let's be honest, are often overloaded, but through local, personal human touchpoints. Because sometimes a conversation in a church basement does more than a therapy session in a government building. Steve finally found his voice, though barely above a whisper. You're telling me something I said years ago is now part of a White House policy. Caroline nodded, her voice calm but charged with conviction. Yes, that whisper gave me the vision. Your words became a second chance for thousands of men and women, just like my dad. Steve sat back slowly like the air had been knocked out of him. He looked down at the cross on his chest again. Not as a decoration now, but as a symbol that had quietly shaped something bigger than he ever imagined. I don't even know what to say, he murmured. You don't have to say anything, Caroline said. You already said it when you didn't know anyone was listening. That's what made it powerful. Steve looked out at the audience, and for the first time in the episode, he stood. You know what he said, voice still thick but stronger. I want to do something. Right now. Caroline looked up, curious. Steve turned to the crowd and raised his hand gently. If you're here today, and you know someone who served, someone who's still hurting, someone who hasn't asked for help yet, I want you to stand. Not to clap, just to stand. For them. One by one, like a slow wave of awakening people began to rise. Elderly couples, middle-aged men in baseball caps, a woman in the front row holding her hands to her heart. Within moments, the entire studio audience was on its feet. Not a word. No cheers, just silence and solidarity. Steve turned back to Caroline, tears once again filling his eyes. You just turned a whisper into a wall of strength, he said. You did that. Caroline rose to stand beside him. No, Steve, she replied. We did that. You spoke it. I carried it. And now we're handing it off to others. The cameras zoomed out, capturing the quiet reverence of the moment. Steve and Caroline stood side by side, not as host and guest, not as celebrity and politician, but as two people from two generations who had found common ground in grace. And just like that, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted, again, not just emotionally, but spiritually. You could feel it, something important had taken root. Steve looked out one more time at the sea of people now standing in silence. I've been on this stage for years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I've had comedians, presidents, actors, and legends sit in that chair. But today, this might be the most important conversation I've ever had. Caroline smiled through tears. That's because it wasn't just a conversation, Steve. It was a calling, and now it belongs to all of us. Steve nodded. He reached for her hand. They stood together not as individuals, but as a symbol of what happens when words born in pain are carried forward in purpose. The lights in the studio didn't dim for a commercial. There was no flashy outro, no dramatic music swell. Just the sound of breathing, of hearts realigning, of hope being planted in places long abandoned. The whisper had become a movement, and it started right there with one sentence spoken from the heart. The air in the studio was thick with something words couldn't hold. After Karoline Leavitt revealed that Steve Harvey's quiet words had inspired a national policy, the Silent Strength Initiative, you could feel it. The moment had transcended entertainment. This wasn't a talk show anymore. It was something sacred, something collective. Steve stood silently, hands still on his chest, his cross gently swaying, as he looked at Caroline overwhelmed. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. Her eyes held something stronger than sound conviction. And then she reached out her hand not just to Steve, but symbolically to everyone watching. Steve, she said, her voice unwavering, stand with me for every veteran still suffering in silence. Steve didn't hesitate. He took her hand. Their fingers met, not as celebrity and public servant, not as host and guest, but as two Americans who had finally said the things so many others had been holding back for years. Caroline turned slowly to face the audience, her voice still calm but now resonant with quiet authority. Please rise, she said. If you know someone who's served, someone who's struggling quietly, someone who never got to say what they carried home. There was no applause, no music, no cue, and yet one by one, people began to rise. A middle-aged woman with her hand on her chest, an older gentleman with a navy pin on his lapel, a couple holding hands, tears streaming down their cheeks, veterans, family members, friends, strangers. Within moments, the entire studio was on its feet, not in celebration, but in reverence. Not clapping, not shouting, just standing. A stillness swept across the room like a tide. A quiet recognition, a collective exhale. It was in every sense of the word, holy. Steve turned his head slowly, taking in the sight, hundreds of people standing, not because they were told to, but because their hearts had been called. His eyes filled again. He looked back at Caroline, who by now had tears gently falling down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from something far deeper, gratitude, fulfillment, a sense of purpose, rising into clarity. Then, without a word, Steve stepped forward and embraced her. It wasn't a TV hug, it wasn't staged or polite. It was the kind of embrace people give when the soul is full, when words have run out, and only closeness will do. Caroline buried her face in his shoulder. Steve closed his eyes. For a long, powerful moment, they simply stood like that, surrounded by a sea of people who understood, many for the first time, that they were not alone. No lights changed, no music swelled. It didn't need it. The silence was the music. The standing room was the message, and in that moment, America stood together, not through politics, not through policy, but through shared pain and shared hope. As they pulled away from the embrace, Steve's voice cracked, but carried warmth. You just made this room something more than a stage, he said. You made it sacred. Caroline nodded, her eyes shining. Because this isn't just a story, Steve. It's a call, and today you answered it with me. Steve looked again to the audience. You all did. And indeed they had. For 5 minutes, no one sat, no one spoke. And yet in that silence, more was said than most speeches could ever hope to accomplish. What began as a casual interview had become a movement not of noise but of presence, not of protest but of standing. The episode wasn't ending with a laugh or a standing ovation. It was ending with something much stronger, a unified stillness. And for everyone in the room and millions watching at home, it would be a moment they'd never forget. The silence in the room was still holding like a deep breath that no one wanted to let go. After the embrace, after the standing tribute, after the wave of tears that had passed through the studio like a sacred wind, Steve Harvey stood motionless, hand gently resting on his chest. His voice, when it returned, was no longer that of the host. It was deeper, a man, stripped of pretense, speaking not from a stage, but from the center of his own heart. I never saw myself this way, he said quietly, his eyes locked on Caroline, then drifting to the audience. But today you made me believe I still matter. The words hung in the air, not loud, not scripted, just real. Karoline nodded slowly. Her reply came with the calm certainty of someone who'd walked through fire and found something eternal on the other side. You reminded me, she said, that faith doesn't have to shout, it just has to be real. The two of them, different in age, background, even public image, had found common ground, not in politics or fame, but in quiet truth, in pain shared, in hope passed from one generation to the next. Karoline then turned not to Steve but to the camera. Her voice didn't rise. It steadied. To anyone watching this, she said, if you're still breathing, you're not done, and we believe in you. The words weren't delivered with the energy of a campaign or the flair of a press release. They were spoken slowly, as if meant to land gently but firmly in the places people hide their brokenness. You don't need a title, she continued. You don't need a microphone or a job in Washington. You just need a little bit of faith and someone who believes that your story isn't over. Steve stepped beside her again, not to speak this time, but simply to stand with her. With every viewer who needed to see that, even in a world so loud and divided, quiet conviction could still reach the heart of a nation. No music played, no flashy graphics appeared. Just a long pause held like a prayer, as the screen slowly began to fade, not to black, but to light. And in that final frame, Steve Harvey's hand on his chest, Karoline's gaze filled with resolve, and a nation left not only in tears but in movement. The message was clear. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is that someone still matters. And someone watching, maybe in a living room, maybe in a hospital bed, maybe sitting alone at a kitchen table, just heard that for the first time in a long time. Because of a whisper, because of a cross, because someone chose to speak when they didn't know anyone was listening. And now the whole country is in a world that often values volume over meaning. This story reminds us that the quietest words can carry the greatest power. Steve Harvey had no idea a sentence he once spoke. Healing doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the silence, would save a veteran's life and inspire a national policy. But it did. And that truth is something we can all carry. You don't have to be famous, wealthy, or in office to change someone's life. You just have to be real, speak with heart, and stay open to the idea that your story still matters. For those of us in our later years, this message is more important than ever. Your wisdom, your scars, your faith, they are not behind you. They are seeds for someone else's healing. If you're still breathing, God's not done with you. And this story proves it. Tell us in the comments, have you ever said something simple that meant the world to someone else? Or has someone's quiet encouragement pulled you through a dark time? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded they still matter.